You are taught to play by the rules, to be kind, fair, and virtuous. You expected the world to reward this goodness, yet you watch as the ruthless advance, the manipulators win, and your morality feels like a handicap. This isn't cynicism, it's a brutal observation of human nature. Over 5 centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli wrote a suppressed manual on this exact phenomenon, arguing that, in the arena of power and survival, conventional morality is not just ineffective, it is often self-defeating. He was labeled a monster for his honesty. But what if he wasn't prescribing evil, but simply diagnosing reality? What if morality fails, not because people are bad, but because the game is rigged? Let's explore why the Prince of Political Realism might have been painfully correct. Carl Jung taught us that what a society loudly proclaims as good, it secretly projects its shadow upon. Our collective morality, the preached virtues of absolute honesty and selfless altruism, often serves as a dazzling persona. This virtuous mask hides the unacknowledged, darker drives for power, security, and dominance that operate in the human psyche. Machiavelli's sin was pulling back this curtain. He spoke from the shadow, articulating the unconscious rules that actually govern group behavior and survival. He wasn't advocating for the shadow's rule. He was courageously describing its undeniable influence in the theaters of politics and human conflict, where ideals are sacrificed to instincts. Machiavelli famously stated that all armed prophets have conquered, and unarmed ones have been destroyed. Translate this psychologically with Carl Jung. The armed prophet is an individual or idea backed by the power of the unconscious, by the raw, instinctual will to exist and persist. The unarmed prophet is pure, disempowered consciousness, a moral idea with no connection to the deeper, driving forces of the psyche or the group. Jung warned of inflation, of identifying only with the positive persona without integrating the shadow's strength. A morality disconnected from the power instinct is naive, destined to be overthrown by forces it refuses to acknowledge or understand. Machiavelli's crucial twist was separating Christian virtue from political virtue. Virtue is goodness. Virtue is efficacy, the force of will and cunning to shape fortune. Through a Jungian lens, virtue aligns with the collective persona, the socially approved mask. Virtue, however, springs from the integrated self, the individual who has harnessed both the light of consciousness and the dark, potent energy of the shadow. It is psychological wholeness applied to action. Machiavelli argued you need virtue to survive. Jung would agree. You need access to your full psychic arsenal, not just your polite mask, to navigate a world that does not play by ideal rules. You can intend to build a utopia, but complex human systems have their own psychic gravity. Carl Jung understood the psyche as a self-regulating system, where overemphasis on one principle like pure morality inevitably breeds its opposite in the shadow corruption, hidden tyranny. Machiavelli observed this and states, a leader trying to impose perfect moral order becomes hated, sparking rebellion, or creates a vacuum of power that darker forces fill. The system seeks balance, not purity. Good intentions, untempered by pragmatic understanding of human ambition, fear, and self-interest, fail because they deny the complex, systemic nature of the human world, both individual and collective. Machiavelli advised the prince to cultivate a public image of mercy, faith, and integrity, while being prepared to act otherwise in private. Carl Jung would analyze this as the conscious, deliberate use of the persona, not as a lie, but as a necessary instrument of For Jung, a healthy persona is flexible, a tool for social function. Machiavelli took this to its logical extreme in politics. To maintain order and project strength, a leader must consciously manage their symbolic image, understanding that perception often holds more power than hidden reality. This is not inherent evil, but a psychological requirement for governing flawed human beings who need reassuring symbols to follow. Machiavelli controversially posited, it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Analyze this through Carl Jung's framework of the psyche. Love in this context is fickle, an emotion tied to the changing moods of the collective. Fear, however, taps into a primal, universal archetype within the human shadow, the instinct for self-preservation. A ruler feared taps into a deeper, more consistent layer of the human psyche than one relying on affectionate approval. Jung might see this as working with the bedrock of instinct rather than the shifting sands of sentiment. It is a grim calculation of what motivates human behavior at its most fundamental, unconscious level. Machiavelli depicted fortune as a raging river or a fickle goddess that must be mastered by masculine virtue. Carl Jung would instantly recognize fortune as a symbol for the unconscious itself, chaotic, unpredictable, and immensely powerful. The individual of pure morality is swept away by this river, a victim of circumstances. The Machiavellian prince with Vertac is the psychologically integrated individual who, through will and cunning consciousness, builds dikes and canals to channel this uncontrollable force. Success isn't about defeating fortune, but about engaging with its chaotic nature without being destroyed by it. A task requiring one to embrace, not deny, the unpredictable darkness of life. Machiavelli said a prince must know how to be both a fox and a lion. The fox discerns traps, the lion frightens wolves. In Jungian terms, this is the ultimate integration of opposites within the psyche. The fox represents cunning, intuition, and shadowy intelligence. The lion represents raw power, courage, and commanding presence. A leader, or any individual seeking efficacy in the world, cannot afford to identify with only one archetype. They must consciously hold and employ both. This synthesis is the essence of Jung's individuation applied to power, moving beyond a one-dimensional moral self to a multifaceted, adaptable whole self capable of navigating a dangerous world. Machiavelli argued that necessary cruelties must be done swiftly and decisively, then delegated, so the prince's hands appear clean. Carl Jung's concept of projection explains this perfectly. The prince projects the cruel shadow aspect onto a subordinate or a single, swift action, preserving his own persona as merciful. The public, seeking a simple moral narrative, willingly accepts this projection, blaming the agent, not the source. This is how moral failure is systematically managed in the real world, not by avoiding dark acts, but by mastering the psychological optics of blame and innocence, a game played with the collective unconscious. We demand moral consistency from leaders, a fatal error according to Machiavellian and Jungian thought. Carl Jung showed the psyche as a theater of competing complexes and archetypes, not a monolithic entity. Consistency is a fiction of the conscious persona. Machiavelli knew the effective ruler must be adaptable, appearing religious to one group, pragmatic to another, merciful today and ruthless tomorrow. This isn't hypocrisy. It's a response to the multifaceted, contradictory nature of reality in human groups. Insisting on rigid moral consistency is a psychological fantasy that fails when confronted with the fluid, ambiguous challenges of maintaining power or order. Machiavelli prized the flexible willow over the sturdy oak, for the willow survives the storm. Carl Jung's entire therapeutic goal was to foster psychic adaptability, the ability to move between attitudes and integrate new content. A rigid, moralistic mindset is like the oak, identified solely with a brittle persona. It shatters when the winds of fortune, or the shadow, blow. The Machiavellian survivor, like the Jungian individuated individual, possesses plasticity. They can bend, employ cunning, retreat, or advance as the situation demands, because their sense of self is not fused to one rigid ideal, but is rooted in the deeper, more fluid self that can wear many masks without losing its core. Just as an individual has a shadow, so does the state. Carl Jung understood that nations project their own dark impulses onto enemy others. Machiavelli's realism operates in this realm. The state, to ensure its survival, must often act in ways that would be immoral for an individual, engaging in deception, preemptive violence, and reality. This is the state enacting the collective shadow. To expect the state to behave with personal morality is a profound category error. It fails because it does not acknowledge the state as a psychic entity with its own survival instincts, operating on a scale where different, darker rules inevitably apply. Machiavelli did not dismiss mercy. He strategized it. He advised that mercy, when shown deliberately and from a position of absolute strength, becomes a powerful tool to secure loyalty. Carl Jung would see this as the conscious integration of a positive archetype, not as a naive virtue but as a wielded instrument. This is morality reclaimed from the realm of automatic conditioning and placed under the domain of the discerning ego. It fails in the naive who offer mercy from weakness, but it succeeds as a calculated element of Vertok, demonstrating that even light must be directed by conscious will to be effective in a shadowed world. The idealist who seeks to impose a perfect moral order suffers from what Carl Jung called psychic inflation. They are identified with a godlike archetype of the savior or perfect ruler, a state where the ego is overwhelmed by an ideal. Machiavelli knew this figure is doomed. Inflation breeds hubris, blindness to practical constraints, and a tyrannical disregard for real human nature. The inevitable collapse is not just political, but psychological. A devastating deflation. Moral idealism fails because it is a form of possession, where the person is not using an idea, but is used by it to the ruin of all. Machiavelli's most compelling argument is the doctrine of necessity, the idea that dire circumstances justify actions otherwise condemned. Carl Jung would identify necessity as a paramount shadow archetype, a psychic force that overrides the conscious moral framework. When survival is at stake, the individual or state is gripped by this archetype, and standard morality dissolves. This explains why moral systems fail in crises. They are structures of the conscious persona, but necessity speaks with the primordial voice of the unconscious, the will to exist. To deny this force is to be annihilated by it. Success requires acknowledging its supreme power. The endpoint of both Machiavellian and Jungian thought is not a monster, but a realist. It is the individual who, like a Jungian integrated self, acknowledges the full spectrum of their psyche, from noble ideals to base instincts. This person does not naively follow morality, nor do they mindlessly embrace cruelty. They assess the landscape with clear eyes, understand the psychic forces at play in themselves and others, and choose the action, whether kind or severe, that serves the desired end. Morality alone fails because it is only half the picture. Efficacy belongs to those who see the whole board, light and dark, and are not afraid to move any piece. Machiavelli shifted the ethical lens from the purity of intentions to the reality of outcomes. A well-intentioned disaster is still a disaster. Carl Jung's model supports this, as psychological health is measured by integration and adaptation, not by good intentions alone. A leader's moral duty, in this framework, is to the stability and survival of the state, which may require morally ambiguous actions. Personal guilt over a dark but necessary act is a failure of the individual's persona, but success for the collective body. Morality fails when it prioritizes the actor's clean conscience over the health and safety of the system. They are responsible for governing. The ultimate lesson from Machiavelli, filtered through Carl Jung, is the achievement of psychological sovereignty. This is the state where you are no longer a slave to either rigid moral codes or unconscious, shadowy impulses. You see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. You understand the archetypal forces of love, fear, fortune, and necessity. You can wear the mask of virtue or wield the tool of ruthlessness with conscious intent, because your sense of self is anchored in the reality of your own multifaceted nature. Morality does not fail, naive people do, by refusing to integrate the full, complex truth of what it takes to survive and thrive in an imperfect world. True power is the courage to see everything. Machiavelli's enduring relevance, viewed through Carl Jung's lens, reveals a uncomfortable truth. Morality often fails because it is a half-truth. It represents the conscious persona, the face we wish to present, while ignoring the potent, shadowy drives of the unconscious that govern real-world conflict, survival, and power dynamics. To be effective is not to abandon ethics, but to expand your awareness to include the full human psyche. The integrated individual, the Machiavellian prince of the soul, understands that virtue is a strategy, mercy a tool, and necessity a supreme force. They succeed not by being good or evil, but by being whole, wielding both the lion's strength and the fox's cunning with conscious intent. The real world rewards not the most moral, but the most psychologically complete. The choice is not between angel and demon, but between the naive, who are ruled by unseen forces, and the sovereign, who see, integrate, and navigate them all.